I mean, as the exhibition makes clear, the motorcycle dates back to 1871. And when the first sort of, motorcycle, which was, someone patented a steam engine that was small enough to fit onto a motorcycle and installed it into a frame similar to that for a sort of pedal bicycle. So, and the motorbike as a symbol of freedom and of coolness, although it probably wasn't called that then, has been probably going back ever since then, really. So in terms of trying to do justice to this topic tonight, I'm going to focus mainly on the post-war period. My geographic focus is going to be the United States, Great Britain and Australia. And I'm not going to discuss the really heavy technical and design aspects of the motorbikes I show in the presentation. Although I will be pointing out the particular models and makes of the bikes, and I saw the exhibition only. I got a chance to go up to Brisbane last weekend to have a look at the exhibition and was noting all the various bikes, many of which are in the presentation I prepared before I saw the exhibition. So the motorcycle gang, the fulcrum around which so much of pop culture's presentation of the motorcycle revolved in the second half of the 20th century, has its origins in post-World War II America, and a sense of alienation and frustration that many veterans felt upon returning home and adjusting to peacetime civilian life. So while their experience in the war was terrifying and traumatic, it was also undeniably exciting. Now faced with the reality of a monotonous 9-to-5 jobs and domestic responsibilities, and some veterans long to create and recapture the sense of camaraderie and exhilaration they felt in the war years. And this is a common theme of a lot of post-war writing and film. The motorcycle was viewed as one way of doing this, a way of recapturing the wartime experience of adventure, excitement, danger, and camaraderie. I've also read some commentary that's talked about the fact that for some men, for some veterans, I should say, motorcycle riding, particularly in a group, was a means to combat the horrifying war memories and experiences that haunted them. So it was sort of an early way of dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. But as these images show, it wasn't just men, of course, that were attracted to the motorcycle, which is something that I'll look at throughout this talk. So let's get into it. I mean, meet Eddie Davenport of Tulare, California. This picture was taken on July 7th, 1947, during a gathering of motorcycle riders. And this image introduced the idea of the lawless biker to popular American consciousness when it appeared on page 31 of the July 21st, 1947 issue of Life magazine. The photograph was snapped by a San Francisco Chronicle newspaper photographer who was covering what became known as the Hollister riot. It also was called the Hollister Invasion. This occurred when an American Motorcycle Association sanctioned Gypsy Tour motorcycle rally in Hollister, California. More motorcyclists than were expected flooded into the small town in Hollister, California, to watch the annual rally, as well as to socialise and to drink. A few of the motorcyclists caused a commotion in the town, and the local police struggled to maintain order. This incident was sensationalised in the press, with reports of bikers taking over the town, quote unquote, and pandemonium in Hollister, according to some press reports. Now, the image of Davenport, obviously drunk, astride his bike, surrounded by discarded beer bottles, and for all we know, an image that was completely staged by the photographer, brought national and very negative attention to the event when it appeared in Life magazine. America, still traumatised by the war and about to be plunged into the paranoia of the Cold War and the Red Scare, was on the lookout for enemies and identified one in the antics of out-of-control biker gangs. But of course, what some people call an enemy or a threat, others see as cool and alluring. So the sensationalist coverage of the so-called Hollister riot had far wider ramifications. One writer who read the media coverage of the event was a chap called Frank Rooney. He wrote a short story, The Cyclist's Raid, published in Harper's Magazine in July 1951, Rooney's story became the basis of the script for what would be one of the earliest and most well-known depictions of the outlaw biker in the 1950s, the 1953 film, directed by Laszlo Benedict and produced by Stanley Kramer and, of course, starring Marlon Brando. Now, this is considered the original outlaw biker film, and it's no exaggeration to say that the Wild One single-handedly popularised the still little-known post-war phenomenon of the motorcycle gang, as well, of course, as giving Marlon Brando one of his most iconic performances as Johnny Strabler, the sullen, cop-hating leader of the Black Rebels motorcycle gang, who ride into a small Californian town called Wrightsville. The town's only elderly lawman struggles to maintain order as the bikers start to cause trouble and end up embarking on a drunken spree of violence, property destruction, and kidnapping. Now, the Wild One established a key trope of subsequent motorcycle gang films, lawless bikers terrorising a small town, and it should be added, in the process, exposing divisions among the mainly white middle-class inhabitants. The Wild One cast real bikers in the film. Much of the Black Rebels dialogue, including Marlon Brando's most famous response to the question, "What are you rebelling against?" "Well, what have you got?" That was taken from these extras. It was a hugely popular film and it was hugely controversial. It was banned by the British Board of Film Classification and remained so until 1967, when it was released with an X certificate. 1967, that's well over a decade later. It was banned or severely cut in many other countries, including New Zealand. And as the Australian day bill on the left hand of this slide shows, strangely, it was released in Australia in its entirety, which is rated only not suitable for children, which is interesting given how zealous Australia's film censors were in the 1950s. The film also fed into concerns around the behaviour of so-called out-of-control young people, which were already brewing in much of the West. And these concerns, the product would gain strength as the 1950s progressed in Australia, Britain, New Zealand, and America, and many other countries. Now, these were linked to many other to many processes that were going on. You've got post-war, you've got growing urbanisation, you've got the notion of the teenager, which is quite a new notion and only really comes into popular parlance in the 1950s. You've got the growing, and most importantly, you've got the growing economic and social importance of independence, of young people, along with the creation of markets catering specifically to them in things like music, fashion, and film. Now, related to this last point, the Wild One was one of several high-profile Hollywood films released around this time, including Teenage Crime Wave and The Blackboard Jungle, that depicted society threatened by switchblade-wielding, out-of-control, leather-jacketed young people. It's worth emphasising that the motorbike, its speed, and the way it enabled young people to escape the confines of their previously circumscribed lives must have seemed to some in authority as a particularly alarming manifestation of the newfound economic and social mobility of post-war youth. Let's just talk a little bit about Brando and his influence. He drove, I believe, and I'm probably going to get some of these wrong, I think, but hopefully not. He rode a British-made Triumph Thunderbird in the Wild One. He was himself an avid motorcyclist. The Triumph motorcyclists, then US importers, Johnson Motors, objected quite strenuously to the use of the Triumph in the film, but they changed their tunes when they realised that it had such a positive impact on sales. And of course, this included actor James Dean's decision to buy a Triumph TR5 trophy motorcycle to mimic Brando. And I mean, sales of the bike really took off. The Wild One's impact was also much wider. The image to the left, the leather jacket, the tilted cap, the Levi jeans, the rolled up cuffs, the boots, his sweeping moody glare, his long sideburns, they really had a significant impact on rebellious, on fashion, on male fashion in the 1950s. This would be the standard look for a lot of youth subculture, known in America as greasers, rockers in the UK, or bodgies and widgies in Australia and New Zealand. Note the image on the right, an uncredited photograph of members of the Auckland Saints Motorcycle Club, taken from their website, in the late 1950s, and you can see the influence of the wild one. I mean, you could argue there's a whole queer interface, which is another aspect we could look at if we had the time. Some gay men began to imitate Brando by wearing black leather jackets, a black leather cap, black leather boots and jeans, and if they could afford it, also riding motorbikes. Let's look at the influence a bit more. The motorbike had been celebrated in music, you know, as far back as Richard Thompson's 1952 acoustic folk anthem, 52 Black Vincent. And of course, there was another prominent example was the Shangri-La's 1964 teen ballad, Leader of the Pack. And of course, Elvis Presley was another influence in this regard. He was profoundly influenced by Brando's look in The Wild One, as you can sort of see there in that picture on the right. He used Johnny Strabler's image as a model for his role in the 1957 film Jailhouse Rock. He also rode a motorbike in his 1964 film Roustabout. Brando's haircut inspired a craze for sideburns, which was followed by James Dean and Elvis Presley. Elvis was actually a keen biker in real life. Another group of young musicians who were influenced by the Wild One were the Beatles. Here they are in a very early publicity still with their pre-Ringo Starr drummer, Pete Best, I think, yes. The Beatles' early look, their long greased hair, their black motorcycle jackets, had its origins in the juvenile delinquent look popularised by Elvis, which had in turn, of course, been popularised by Brando in The Wild One. One story has it that the Beatles even took their band name, from the girlfriends of the rival motorcycle club in The Wild One, who were referred to as Beatles. So as a trickle of films focusing on motorcycles continued to appear in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and most of these were quickly made teensploitation films, B films, aimed at the youth market. Black Rider is the one on the left. That's a British film. And of course, were a lot in America, I mean, of which, you know, one well-known one was Drag Strip Riot. I love that poster for Drag Strip Riot. The perspective there is great. Story set in a small coastal Californian town and concerns a conflict between a group of members of a sports car club who are enjoying driving their Corvettes during a summer vacation retreat and an outlaw motorcycle group, depicted in all their carnality, wearing leather jackets with greasy hair, and in an interesting, in the context of our discussion for The Wild One, sporting again long sideburns. It's worth noting that, you know, the cinematic influence was far wider than that. You know, another of motorcycles. Another relatively early motorcycle film that's worth checking out is Sidney J. Fury's 1964 effort, The Leather Boys. It's a stark piece of kitchen sink realism set amidst Britain's rocker culture. It focuses on two South London rockers, Reggie and Dot, who despite their youth decide to marry. Their relationship is tested by his provincialism, her self-focus, and their combined immaturity. And as they drift apart, Reggie befriends fellow rocker Pete, Dudley Sutton there, and starts to explore the wider meaning of emotional commitment, unaware that Pete wants much more from their mateship than a bit of fun riding their 650cc Triumph Bonnevilles. It's a bleak but fascinating look at early 60s British rocker culture, and actually is now recognised as an early piece of important queer cinema. And it was the screenplay, written by Gillian Freeman, was based on her 1961 novel of the same name. The paperback on the right-hand side of that is, you know, not surprisingly, doesn't really give any hint of the gay themes in the book, and chooses instead to focus on the angle of out-of-control bikers. Ride hard, die young, England's motorcycle gangs. Let's look at another influential cinematic representation of the motorbike, the 1963 war epic, The Great Escape, directed by John Sturges. I think a lot of you probably will have seen the film. which is basically based on a novel of the same name, actually by an Australian-born World War II fighter pilot during the war who was shot down and imprisoned in a German POW camp and wrote a book about it after the war, which was then made into The Great Escape. While much of the film accurately depicts the events in the author's book, Sturges took some liberties with the story. And one of those liberties, of course, was one of the film's most iconic scenes, the motorcycle chase featuring Steve McQueen as Virgil Hiltz, the Cooler King. And this culminates in Hiltz jumping a barbed wire fence. The bike was a Triumph TR6 trophy, which was painted to resemble a German machine. Now, while McQueen was a skilled biker, due to insurance concerns, he was prevented from doing the actual scenes himself, and the jump was done by a stunt person and a fellow motorcycle enthusiast, a chap called Bud Enkins. I suspect the association with McQueen at the height of his career then, and one of the foremost icons of 1960s respectable masculine cool, and the film, a blockbuster war epic with a big name ensemble cast, would have played a major role in legitimising the motorbike for many middle-class males. I couldn't find very much written about this, but it certainly corresponds with what some have analysed as the sort of commodification of the image of the motorcycle rider in mid-century America, which started from the mid-1960s onwards. Coexisting with the motorcycle's status as an anti-authoritarian symbol was its growing role as a piece of sort of middle-class sartorial expression. Related to this, US motorcycle manufacturers recognised that sales were being held back by the outlaw biker image and started to explicitly advertise to a broader section of the population. Those plans ran into some problems by this group, the Hells Angels. 3 years after McQueen's stunt double jumped the barbed wire, popular conceptions of the motorbike again changed, with the release of the US gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson's 1967 book, Hells Angels, The Strange and Terrible Saga of Outlaw Motorcycle Gangs. The book started life as a March 1965 article in the American magazine, The Nation. It generated so much interest that Thompson decided to spin it into a book. He spent a year with the infamous San Francisco-Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels, and he remained close with the Angels for a year after he had completed the book, but ultimately the relationship waned. It ended for good after several of the members of the gang gave him what was referred to as a savage stomping, as it was referred to by the Angels, over a remark made by Thompson to an angel named Junkie George, who was beating his wife. And Thompson objected to that and said, only a punk beats his wife. Go Hunter S. The book was well received and helped launch Thompson's career as a writer. It also served to focus public attention on the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. So this attention had been bubbling away for a while now. Since the release in 1965 of a report by the US Attorney General, which basically a 15-page report that read like a plot synopsis of a Mickey Spillane's worst dreams, according to Hunter S. Thompson and Hells Angels. It was followed by a wave, so the release of this report by the Attorney General into the Hells Angels was followed by a wave of media reports, signalling bikers as America's new domestic public enemy #1. A number of other things propelled the Hells Angels into the public spotlight into the second half of the 1960s. Prominent among these, of course, was the 1969 Rolling Stones Altamont Speedway concert, at which Hells Angels working as bouncers killed an audience member. There was also the general temper of the time, the social turmoil of the race riots, the growth of the counterculture, the escalating war in Vietnam, all created a hothouse atmosphere of anxiety in which outlaw bikers became one key focus. Now, and the Angels themselves had a mixed reputation too. They had quite a prominent sort of link to the counterculture in the second half of the 1960s. They were linked to the sort of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. They had prominent members. They also had links to prominent members of the countercultural scene, including One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest author Ken Kesey, beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead, and Timothy Leary. They also had links to organised crime, drugs, extortion and prostitution. This was emphasised by their their reputation as so-called what's called one percenters, a one percenter motorcycle club, a fact that they advertised by the 1% patch worn on their colours, said to refer to a comment by an American Motorcycle Association person who supposedly made in response to the 1947 Hollister riot, which I mentioned earlier. This person said that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, implying that the last 1% were outlaws. Now, where public attention went, of course, popular culture followed. Hollywood responded to the hysteria around outlaw motorcycle gangs with a deluge of films. These contains mixed signals, depicting the groups like Hell's Angels as violent, immoral, sexually depraved criminals one moment, cool, freedom-loving rebels the next. Released in 1966, a year before Thompson's book, and billed as, quote, the most terrifying film of our time, Wild Angels is a really well-known example. It was directed by Roger Corman, the first of 5 biker films that Corman's American International Pictures would do. Now, as we've seen, it was not the first film to exploit the out-of-control biker gang, but as British academic Bill Osgerby has noted, it gave the fullest play to the outlaw biker as a spectacle of unsettling otherness. With the historic publicity tag, their credo is violence, their god is hate, the film courted controversy with a violation of square taboos that proved both influential and highly bankable. Corman supposedly became interested in making a film about the Hells Angels after seeing a photo of a biker funeral in a 1966 issue of Life magazine. Wild Angels was made in 15 days on a budget of $360,000 and was a box office smash. It was the first big role for Peter Fonda as Heavenly Blues, pictured there, a nihilistic leader of a fictional chapter of the San Pedro Californian Hells Angels. And of course, there is also his quote-unquote old lady, Mike, who's played by Nancy Sinatra, who's also pictured. The Wild Angels had, the usual signifiers of an outlaw biker gang, the leather jackets, the black skivvies, mixed it with a sort of beat aesthetic, which was also sort of they had berets, they had a surf music soundtrack. They also featured real members of the Hells Angels and the Coffin Cheaters as biker gangs in the films. I mean, Corman obviously just took influences from wherever in that one. It was not just, however, the film industry that cashed in on the public's fascination with outlaw bikers. The genre of pulp magazines known as men's adventure magazines or sweat magazines that proliferated on newsstands in a number of countries in the 1950s and 60s also exploited the phenomenon. These magazines featured macho, over-the-top tales of allegedly true life adventures and opinion on hot-button issues. Generally, the stories were presented as first-person exposés, and they tried to affect the sort of insider ripped from the headlines tone. Needless to say, they took a very liberal approach to the facts and were more intent on finding the most sensational angle on which to hook their largely male blue-collar readership. Again, outlaw bikers were a major focus of this. You can see the one on the left from the Bikers Ravage a Small Town. That's on the cover of Men magazine. And counterimposed in that, you can also see the sort of, there on the right is the sort of, inside look at the sort of My Terror Ride with the outlaw bikers. The 1950s the 1950s to the 1970s saw a boom in cheap mass market or pulp paperbacks. These publishers needed a constant stream of content, and the ever-changing face of youth subculture was always a key inspiration. In the early 1950s, pulp had focused on inner-city juvenile delinquents. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, they focused on beatniks. And by the second half of the 1960s, they were starting to focus on hippies and, of course, motorcycle gangs. So pulp is about speed, both the way it was written, its narrative pace and plots, and nothing is faster or more dangerous and difficult to control than young people on two wheels. The mid to late 60s breed of bikers were typified in the public's imagination by long hair, filthy clothes, chopped up Harley Davidson, and shared bacchanalian tastes of the counterculture in terms of illicit drugs and a rejection of mainstream society's mores, particularly around sex. Now, this was manna from heaven for pulp publishers, hungry for the next story, and the hard-working scribes who, of course, penned the tales. Most biker-themed pulp fiction published in the US, Great Britain and Australia, where motorcycle gangs were called bikies, followed a similar trajectory. A gang of vicious motorcycle thugs menaced selected members of mainstream society, particularly females, often in a small rural town. Carnage inevitably follows, as was the case with earlier targets, inner city teenage youth gangs and beatniks. Pulp paperbacks focused on motorcycle gangs. Pulp paperbacks' fascination with motorcycle gangs, particularly oriented around the transgressive nature of the female, who's involved either as a girlfriend or a sidekick or an actual member of the gang. That's a key focus that we'll see in a lot of the pulp fiction and also increasingly in a lot of the film and other products around the motorcycle. Now, the sexualisation of culture that happens in the late 1960s in a lot of countries, including Australia, left no stone unturned. That's including the motorcycle film. In the 1968 British-French co-production, Girl on a Motorcycle, frustrated young housewife Rebecca, Marion Faithfull, leaves her husband asleep in bed to meet her lover, Danielle, a pipe-smoking university professor, Alain Delon. This being the height of the swinging 60s, Rebecca does a trip suited in a full-body leather suit astride a Harley Davidson, a present from Danielle, the pipe-smoking university professor. Was based on a novel by surrealist writer Andrew Nette, I think that's how I pronounce it. Girl on a Motorcycle, which was released in the US as Naked Under Leather, is low on dialogue and plot, that's being generous to it, but heavy on garish psychedelic special effects and nudity, particularly Faithfull's. The bike that Faithfull is seen riding at high speeds throughout the film is a Harley Davidson Electra Glide. She had a stunt double, and the close-up scenes involving her she was seated on the motorcycle, which was fixed to a platform and pulled by a vehicle. The film is probably best known for redefining the leather worn by motorcyclists into the full body suit that Faithfull wore in the film, and that has a huge impact, has a significant impact on popular culture. The motorcycle as a tool of female emancipation is an interesting spin on the common trope in the late 60s of the housewife rebelling against her boring existence, but sort of undercut by the ending in which Rebecca ploughs headfirst into a truck and dies. But hey, it's the 1960s. No one really gets out alive. On the left-hand side, you can see another example of the eroticisation of the motorcycle. Bridget Bardot sings a song called Harley Davidson in a 1967 album and poses with the inspiration in an over-the-knee leather boots and matching leather shorts. Now, it's important to stress that while the popular, I mean, you could do a whole talk on this alone. It's important to stress that the popular depiction of the motorcycle culture on the big screen and in pulp was often quite macho. This was not monolithic, as can be seen by their covers. The idea of the violent, predatory, all-female biker gang was a staple of many films, although for the most part, the inversion of power relations often remained framed very much in terms of, sexual titillation. Films like She Devil on Wheels, 1968, is a prime example. It's worth pointing out that the trope of the female biker gang went far beyond the US, though, as can be seen by the still on the right. That's for a 1970 Japanese film called Stray Cat Rock Delinquent Girl Boss, one of 5 films of the so-called Stray Cat cycle. And if you haven't seen this cycle of film, I'd really recommend that you do it. It's just amazing. It follows the exploits of a gang of female bikers led by Miko Kaji, who also starred in the Lady Snowblood and Female Prisoner Scorpion film franchises. But of course, no talk about the coolness and the impact of the motorbike in the post-war period is complete without talking about Easy Rider. a game changer in terms of how the motorcycle was conceptualised in popular culture when it came out in 1969. The idea for the film was supposedly conceived by one of its stars, Peter Fonda, while he was in Canada promoting his 1967 Roger Corman drug film, The Trip. He was autographing a movie still from The Wild Angels, which I mentioned earlier, depicting Bruce Dern, one of the film's stars, and himself sharing one motorcycle when he conceived of the idea for Easy Rider. The film involves Wyatt, Fonda, and Billy, Dennis Hopper, setting out from Los Angeles to New Orleans on Harley-Davidson bikes to discover America. They encounter dirt farmers, freaks, rednecks, see some amazing country, spend time with Jack Nicholson's small-town alcoholic liberal lawyer, Hanson, and drop acid with two prostitutes in a graveyard. One of those prostitutes being a very early role by a young Karen Black. Easy Rider was phenomenally influential, more for its iconic look and groundbreaking soundtrack, which included songs by the band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience and Steppenwolf. The film was shot totally outside studio channels for $350,000 and made its distributor, Columbia, a staggering $69 million gross, a sum that is almost unthinkable today in today's movie-going climate. It's also credited with having kickstarted what is referred to as the New Hollywood movement, as the film industry realised there was more money to be made from low-budget films made by outsiders targeting different demographics. Film critic Matt Zola Setz has written the film, quote, transcends its cultural moment because it's about more than bikers and hippies or the tension between libertines and reactionaries. It's about the difficulty of escaping social conditioning and economic imperatives and sustaining a truly free life. Hopper, Fonda, don't merely validate a mythical image of life outside mainstream, they show how tough it is to live that way. The members of the commune, Billy and Wyatt visit, eke out a subsistence living. Our heroes spend so many nights outdoors, not because they love looking at the stars, but because even low-rent motels won't take guys that look like them. I think the most interesting aspect of the film, from my perspective, is the way that it marks a turning point between the optimism of the 1960s Summer of Love and the colder reality of the 1970s. Wyatt and Billy are not exactly heroes, and their journey of self-discovery is financed by a drug deal involving several bags of cocaine sourced in Mexico, which they sell to a businessman in Los Angeles, played by Phil Spector. That said, there's an innocence to it, an almost naive aspect to their exploration, a determination to be free, as we've talked about, and live outside mainstream society, that's reminiscent of an earlier period of the counterculture, and which blurs a harder biker identity with a softer sort of flower power aesthetic. The film typifies the transition from the more violent outlaw biker film we talked about earlier to the more free-spirited bike rider who's more focused on self-actualization than bringing violence to small-town America. Now, as I've said, Easy Rider had, as one critic put it, a sledgehammer impact on popular culture. It resulted in an explosion of biker films across the world, many of them, as I've said, with more wholesome content and themes. An excellent example is the 1970 film CC and Company, which starred former NFL football player turned actor Joe Namath and Anne Margaret. And the image from the left is Namath astride a Harley on the February 1971 cover of the influential magazine Esquire. Harley-Davidson took full advantage of the publicity generated by Easy Rider, as attested by the 1973 advertisement, "The Great American Freedom Machine." That's on the right. The bikes that used in Harley-Davidson were Harley-Davidson Hydroglide bikes purchased secondhand from the LAPD at a cost of $500 each. Each bike had to have a backup made so that shooting could continue in case one of the old machines failed or got wrecked. They were customised by hand into what I believe is called a chopper. Exactly who did that is an interesting question and opens up another aspect of the biker and its coolness and its appeal, of the motorbike, and its coolness and appeal, which we could go into if we had the time. Fonda claimed in a 2007 interview that he built the motorcycles used in Easy Rider. I bought 4 of them from the Los Angeles Police Department. I love the political incorrectness of that. And 5 black guys from Watts helped me build these. The real story that emerged suggests that the bikes used in the film were built by completely built, that is, by 2 African-American bike builders, Clifford Sonny Vors, who designed bikes, and Ben Hardy, a prominent chopper builder in Los Angeles, who worked on their construction. Vors belonged to an integrated motorcycle club known as the Chosen Few. He was fired and replaced early in the film's production, and his name does not appear in the credits, and he has subsequently criticised the absence of black characters in the film. And this is, an important time to note that black Americans, African Americans, have a lengthy history of involvement in motorcycle culture in that country, which I just simply could not find the time to include in this talk. But there's a bit online about it, but and I'm sure that there would be more if you looked hard. The motorcycles continued to function as a symbol of freedom and self-discovery in film. An excellent example is the 2004 The Motorcycle Diaries. I think probably many of you will be familiar with that. The coming-of-age story depicts the journey by medical student Ernesto Che Guevara and his friend Alberto Granado from Argentine to Peru in the early 50s, based on Guevara's travelogue of the same name, supplemented by Granado's travelling with Che Guevara, the making of a revolutionary. The antithesis of the violent high-speed gangs that populate most motorcycle films. The 2 characters begin their journey sharing a dilapidated 1939 Norton 500, which they name the Mighty One. The mechanical death of the bike halfway through the journey forces the 2 to start actually engaging with those they meet, opening their eyes to the poverty, hardship, and political oppression experienced by many South Americans on the continent. And of course, the motorbikes continued to be a symbol of coolness and danger in cinema. And here's just 2 examples of countless examples. Uma Thurman in Volume 1 of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill franchise. The film shows her character riding a Kawasaki ZZR 250 motorbike through the streets of nighttime Tokyo. And of course, she spends her time in Japan wearing that sort of matching motorcycle jacket. And of course, there we are, Tom Cruise on a black BMW in the 6th Mission Impossible film, Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. I read somewhere that this bike has a staggering top speed of 200 miles per hour, which is pretty amazing. Let's just talk about the UK and Australia. Much of my talk's focused on the US, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about popular culture depiction of the motorbike in the United Kingdom. Motorcycle gangs first started in Britain in the 50s and followed a similar trajectory to the US, known as rockers, ton-up boys and leather boys. They were initially heavily influenced by US biker culture, especially their adopted uniform, jeans, leather jackets, heavy boots, the pompadour-style haircuts, a style that we can see was influenced by the Wild One. Although, as you can see there, I love that you can see that one of them's also British bikers smoke pipes. British bikers in the 1950s were the subject of considerable media interest, as was the case in America. They were also the subject of paper and magazine writers. Note the commonality in their treatment in these 2 publications. Live fast, love hard, die young, and thrill crazy kids living for kicks, for girls and for speed. You can't really talk about the motorcycle in the UK without looking at this film, Quadrophenia. In the early to mid 1960s, the mortal enemy of rockers were the mods. Their mutual enmity culminated on a bank holiday weekend in May 16 to 18, 1964, when the 2 sides engaged in a series of well-publicised beachside clashes in the seaside resorts of Margate and Brighton, which resulted in over 100 arrests. The event scandalised Great Britain, and the tabloids ran headlines like "The Battle of Brighton" and "Wild Ones Beat Up Margate." Of course, it's worth stressing that both youth tribes had their own preferred types of 2-wheeled transport, scooters for the mods and motorbikes for the rockers. And this event was depicted in the 1979 film Quadrophenia. Jimmy, Phil Daniels, is a classic juvenile delinquent rebel, working a dead-end job during the week to fund his weekend motorcycle exploits with his mates. He's trying to sort of, get in close with the aloof female mod Steph. And while the film's central narrative, Jimmy's gradual disillusionment with the mod lifestyle, now feels a bit obvious, the extended riot scenes have a real visceral energy, and there's a great soundtrack by The Who. Now, in the late 1960s and 1970s in the UK, the developments followed the US, with Harley Davidson riding local chapters of the Hells Angels and Outlaws, representing a new wave of motorcycle menace in the eyes of polite British society. These concerns were perfect fodder for a group of young editors working at the publisher New English Library. Looking to expand the publisher's list and appeal to young readers, they commissioned a series of novels crammed with nihilistic sex and violence that resonated with the disaffected youth of the early 1970s Britain. And here's some examples of these. On the one hand, these sort of bikes, these are sort of very sort of classic pulp tales of bikers, but they were also, much more sophisticated, with female bikers. A slew of these books followed the success of the first one, which was Chopper in 1971. The better of these combine, sex and violence with, as I say, more sophisticated themes: authoritarian government crackdowns, various flamboyant biker tribes, the Skulls, who are futuristic skinheads, and a gay Hells Angels chapter known as the Ghouls, who dress in satin and platform heels, hallucinogenic drugs, and references to everything from Siddhartha to Jung and Lord of the Rings. In one novel, The Devil's Biker, The Devil's Rider, 1973, that one by Alex R. Stewart, that one on the left. NAL fused the biker story with occult horror, featuring an outlaw biker group called the Sons of Baal that practiced black magic rituals and sacrifices at pagan sites such as Stonehenge and Glastonbury. We don't know who photographed these covers for the New English Library youthploitation books, but I find them quite fascinating. They're obviously cheaply done, obviously staged with models. Probably, they've probably got the copy boy and the secretary out and dressed them up. But they have a real rough verisimilitude. They're like snaps taken by an amateur photographer who is part of whatever subcultural group the novels are about. You see that with all those New English Library novels in the early 1970s. Very briefly, let's talk about Australia. Motorcycle gangs were also a major focus of pulp publisher Horwitz in the late 1960s and the 1980s. Australia was no exception to the trends discussed in this presentation. Influenced by British rockers and the US Hells Angels, motorcycles gangs grew in popularity. And while the Sydney-based pulp publisher Horwitz had released some motorcycle themes stories in the 1960s, biker novels became a much more major part of their publishing list in the early 70s. The usual standard plots: bikies sort of, terrorising rural towns. The outlaw female biker gang is a key trope, as can be seen by Biker Birds here. That was first published in the 1973 and was so popular it was re-released twice in 1976 and 1983, which is that one you can see there in the middle. Bikers were also, local interest in bikers was further piqued by films like Stone, released in 1974, a precursor to the 1979 Ozploitation classic Mad Max, which combines Australia's sort of masculine road culture, bikers, and aspects of a sort of dystopian future that are very similar to the ones that were in those New English Library books. Unorthodox policeman Stone, Ken Shorter, a former cop in real life, is assigned to travel undercover with a satanic outlaw biker gang, the Grave Diggers, after an unknown assassin starts murdering its members. The first and last film, directed by television actor Sandy Harbut, it features an iconic Australian cast. It was dismissed by many critics upon its release, but it was a huge hit in Australia and internationally, partly on the back of its impressive stunt work and the sheer spectacle of it. Several hundred real-life bikers took part in the film's most famous scene, which I think is also in the exhibition, which is the highway funeral procession for one of the deceased grave diggers, for which the bikie extras were reportedly paid in beer. Going to the last sort of couple of slides now, no discussion of the bike, the motorbike in Australia is complete without, of course, talking about the most influential Australian film with motorbikes in it, which is Mad Max, the first of which appeared in 1979. The image on the left shows the absolutely insane lengths that Mad Max cinematographer David Eggerby went for a handheld point of view shot. The one on the right is one of the most recognisable characters. In the first film, Highway Patrolman Jim Goose Rains, played, of course, by Steve Bisley, who rides a Japanese Kawasaki bike, which had a number of customised retro fittings. Of course, Mad Max spawned 3 sequels, each with their own take on the futuristic motorbike aesthetic. My favourite, I think, is Wes, the main villain from the 1981 film Mad Max 2, or The Road Warrior, as it was released in America. Wes rode a modified Kawasaki 900, K1 900, and I particularly like the sort of punk queer aesthetic, his eyeshadow and his mohawk haircut. These and other installments of the franchise have been incredibly influential. Resulted in a large number of knockoff films, and all dealt with sort of, future societies that have broken down and are ravaged by sort of various outlaw motorcycle gangs. What I didn't know until I researched it is that in the US, and for all I know in other areas too, the franchise has also inspired a network of Mad Max costume designers and scene reenactments. And if you've got the money, you can approach these people and actually get particular bikes custom made that are based on your favourite character in the film. So we could go on. There's a lot more to say, but I think maybe end it there and go to questions.